Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Ranely Mendoza. I hope you have been learning a lot from our EBM modules. At this point, we are going to talk about how to make evidence-based clinical decisions using articles on diagnostic tests. As we all know, these tests are useful in helping us arrive at the correct diagnosis and, in the long term, managing each patient appropriately. However, we must be conscientious in requesting diagnostic tests. We must not fall into the habit of routinely requesting for them because many times it may be inefficient or sometimes even detrimental to a patient. So before doing any diagnostic test, consider the following. Is the test accurate enough to help treatment decisions? In other words, will the results change the way a patient is managed? Or is the test appropriate or acceptable to the patient? Otherwise, you might need to consider requesting for another diagnostic test or maybe not doing a diagnostic test at all because in many instances, it is not even necessary. Now let us look at what usually happens in the clinics. With each patient encounter, with the proper clinical history and physical examination, we usually obtain enough information for us to decide on what to do next for our patient. We could actually do one of three things. First, we can reassure the patient that no further diagnostic testing or treatment is necessary and observe the patient. Or we could go immediately to treatment either with pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic interventions. And the third option is to request for diagnostic tests. Hopefully, these diagnostic tests will be useful in strengthening our current impression of the patient and also guiding us in the next steps of management. Now let's transform what happens in the clinics into what we call thresholds and probabilities. Because after all, this is an EBM course. So the first thing that we have to learn is setting the upper testing threshold. This is also called your treatment threshold. This is the probability of disease that you will stop diagnostic testing and start the contemplated management. So imagine a line from 0 to 100. And for instance, you will set your treatment threshold at 60%. So if the probability of the disease that you are considering for your patient falls anywhere to the right of 60%, then you will decide not to do any diagnostic testing but proceed with treatment immediately. So next is your lower testing threshold. This is also called your diagnostic threshold. This is the probability of disease that you will rule out without any further testing. So again, in our line, for instance, you set your threshold at 5%. So any probability below 5% would make you rule out the disease because it is less likely for the patient even when you haven't done any diagnostic test yet. So these testing thresholds are arbitrary and may depend on your experience and confidence as a clinician. Some things may affect setting your thresholds, whether you will move it to the right, to the left, higher or lower. And these are the things which I am talking about: the severity of the disease, the cost of the test, the safety and invasiveness of the test, and the cost of safety of the intervention itself. For instance, if you are talking about a very serious condition which has a very high attack rate and very contagious, then you would probably set a diagnostic threshold lower than 5% because you don't want to miss out this diagnosis. You really want to be sure that the patient is not having the disease before totally ruling it out. So now that you have set your diagnostic and treatment threshold, you are now able to identify what we call the testing zone. The testing zone is the probability of the disease that fall between the lower and upper testing thresholds. So your testing zone is also called the gray area. We also have the pretest probability. This is the probability that the patient has the disease before doing a diagnostic test. The pretest probability may be determined based on the prevalence of the disease in question in the community, the presence or absence of risk factors, and the presence or absence of certain signs and symptoms based on your patient's clinical history and physical examination. Again, that's the pretest probability. After that, you will have to determine the post-test probability. This is the probability that a patient has the disease after doing a diagnostic test. Later on, we will learn how we can determine the post-test probability from the pre-test probability and the characteristics and results of the test that you have done on your patient. Now let's try putting all those things together. So imagine your decision line from 0 to 100%. The first thing that we need to do is to set our diagnostic threshold or your lower testing threshold and your treatment threshold or your upper testing threshold. The area between that is your gray area or your testing zone. And then if you set your pretest probability and it falls anywhere within the gray area, the next decision for you now is to do a diagnostic test. And based on the properties of your test, you can now determine the post-test probability of the disease in your patient. After doing the test and the post-test probability is negative and it falls beyond your diagnostic threshold, you can confidently rule out the disease. If the test result comes out positive and the post-test probability falls beyond your treatment threshold, again, you can proceed with doing your contemplated management for your patient with the condition you are considering because now you are more confident of your diagnosis. Okay, so let's try doing this on a sample case and then we will proceed with appraising an article on diagnostic tests. So for instance, we have a 28-year-old male, a BPO employee. He is currently asymptomatic, he has no known comorbidities, he occasionally smokes only when he is stressed, and on PE was found to have normal physical exam findings. His diabetic father, however, who lives in the same household, tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR test 5 days prior. So he was advised by his company to undergo testing for COVID-19 before reporting for work on site. And the company provided him with a SARS-CoV-2 antigen rapid test kit. Now he wants to know if he can be cleared to go back to work based on the result of the rapid antigen test kit. So applying what you have learned earlier about EBM, you search for an article, find the best available evidence. But before doing that, as we said, we have to set our thresholds and our pretest probability. So at this point, we are considering the possibility of COVID-19. As we said earlier also, for diseases which are more serious and have more serious consequences, not just for the patient, but for the population in general, if it is not diagnosed properly, we would need to set a somewhat lower diagnostic threshold. So let's set our diagnostic threshold at 2%, which is relatively low. And then if, because the patient is asymptomatic, the only treatment that you have in mind is isolation, monitoring, and observation of your patient. And also, because he might turn out positive, then you would ask him to refrain from going to work while he is on isolation. So we may set the treatment threshold with the management plan that we are contemplating at 60%. So, considering the prevalence of COVID-19 during this time of pandemic, the exposure of the patient, well, somewhat his risk factor of smoking and the attack rate of COVID-19 based on previous studies among close contacts of patients who were tested positive, let's set the pretest probability of the patient of having COVID-19, that is before doing the test, at 30%. So remember that. We will be using that later on as we apply the results of the article that we are going to appraise. Okay? So now we are faced with a clinical question among asymptomatic household contacts of a COVID-19 confirmed case. What is the accuracy of a rapid antigen test in diagnosing SARS-CoV-2 infection? After a thorough search of the literature, you were able to find this article by Torres et al., published at the Clinical Microbiology and Infection Journal, just this 2021, entitled Evaluation of a Rapid Antigen Test, the PanBio, for SARS-CoV-2 detection in asymptomatic close contacts of COVID-19 patients. At this point, I'd like to say to the audience that I have no conflict of interest to declare, and I am not in any way related or affiliated with the manufacturers or distributors of the test that we are going to present to you now. Okay, so you have learned also in previous modules that when we appraise an article, we look at four things. We appraise it for relevance, for validity, for the results that are presented, and applicability. So the first question is on relevance. Is the objective of the article relevant to your clinical question? So remember the case that we are faced with. In this article, the objective was to evaluate the diagnostic performance of the rapid antigen test in identifying SARS-CoV-2 infected asymptomatic individuals. They looked particularly at household and non-household contacts of confirmed COVID-19 cases. So yes, the objective of the article is similar to our clinical dilemma. The next step is to appraise the validity. The first question is that, was there an independent comparison with a reference standard? So what's a reference standard? It is the diagnostic test that gives information that is closest to the truth, and it is the generally acceptable to most clinicians in detecting a particular disease. One aspect of this question that you have to take note of is independent comparison. It means that the reader of the reference standard must not know the results of the diagnostic test being evaluated. So for the Torres article, the reference standard used in the article was RT-PCR, which is the accepted confirmatory test that we are using right now for COVID-19. And the RT-PCR was done at the microbiology service of a hospital in Valencia, Spain, while the rapid antigen test was done at the point of care health facility. So these were tested independently by different individuals. Okay, so our answer to this is yes. Next, did the subjects include an appropriate spectrum of patients to whom the test will be used? So why is this important? Ideally, the test should be done on healthy or asymptomatic patients, those who are severely ill, and even those in between in order to obtain the average accuracy of the test. So studies on patients at one end of the spectrum might either over or underestimate the accuracy of the test. So it's very important that you get the full spectrum. But for this particular study and for our patient, the article specifically conducted the study among asymptomatic close contacts of COVID-19 cases. So when using the results of this study, we have to bear that in mind. We must take care to interpret and apply the results of this study on this particular subset of patients only. But remember also that this is the subset of patients to which our own patient belongs, so this may be applicable to him as well. Okay? The next question that we have to ask is, was the reference standard done regardless of the result of the diagnostic test being evaluated? This is done to avoid verification bias. Because if the reference standard is done only among those who tested positive in the test being evaluated, it might falsely increase the accuracy of the test. So what did they do in the Torres study? In this study, RT-PCR and rapid antigen tests were done in all patients. 2 nasal swab specimens were obtained from each participant, and each specimen was to be tested for either of the 2 tests. So the reference standard was done regardless of the test result of the rapid antigen test. Now that we have ascertained the validity of the study in question, we may now proceed with appraising the results. So the question for you to answer is this: what were the likelihood ratios for the different possible test results? So what are likelihood ratios? This determines by how much a positive or a negative test result increases or decreases the probability of disease in a patient. So here, I'm just showing you here some rough estimates of how large or small the shift in the post-test probability can be given by the values of the different likelihood ratios presented here. So many times in studies, the likelihood ratio itself is not presented. What is usually given is either is both the sensitivity and specificity of the test result. So as a reminder, I'm sure you have learned this already. We can construct a 2 by 2 table. Patients with disease or without disease are determined by the results of the reference standard, and the positive and negative test result is based on the test in question. So you can compute for sensitivity using this formula, and also specificity from this 2 by 2 table can be computed from this formula. Okay? So because our interest is looking at likelihood ratios, we can actually compute for likelihood ratios based on the sensitivity and specificity of a test. But remember that for any given test, we determine two types of likelihood ratios because a test can either be positive or negative. So we have to compute for both the likelihood ratio of a positive test and the likelihood ratio of a negative test. So these are the formulas which you can use in deriving the likelihood ratio from a sensitivity or specificity given in the article of choice or the chosen article. So the LR positive or the likelihood ratio of a positive test is computed as follows, and the likelihood ratio of a negative test is computed based on this formula. So kindly take note of this formula and we will use that later. In the Torres study, the sensitivity and specificity of the rapid antigen tests were given. We will focus particularly on the results they presented on the subgroup of patients who are household contacts of COVID-19 confirmed cases because this is the characteristic of our own patient. So the sensitivity was reported at 50.8% and specificity at 98.6%. Actually, it reached up to 100%, but for purposes of illustration of computation, we will use the 98.6% so that we avoid the infinity values. So this will be for academic purposes also. So the 98.6% is the lower limit of the confidence interval for the specificity of the rapid antigen test. Again, based on the previous formulas, the LR positive for this test was 36.3 and the LR negative was 0.5. Later, we will be using these values in applying the results to our particular patient. Okay? So now we will proceed with appraising the applicability of the results to our patient. The first question that you have to ask is, can the test and its results be applied to your patient or to our patient? Here we must consider the clinical characteristics of the patients in the study, which must be similar to your patient. So yes, the Torres article was similar because study subjects were household or non-household contacts. The age range was 10 to 86 years old. Remember that our patient falls within this age group. Conducted on both males and females, asymptomatic, and tested within 1 to 7 days upon diagnosis of a confirmed COVID-19 case contact. So the patient went to your clinic 5 days after his father tested positive for COVID-19. For these tests, it's very important to look also at the timing because of the characteristic and pathophysiology of the viral illness. The next question is the test and its results acceptable and preferred by the patient? So this was what we were alluding to earlier. So you look at whether the patient is amenable to doing the test because of course as family physicians, we don't just consider the illness or the disease but the patient as a whole and the context from which he comes from. So yes, the test kit was free since it was provided by his company. He preferred using it actually because of faster results, and he was willing to have a nasopharyngeal swab done in order to obtain a specimen for testing. Remember, some patients are afraid not just of the results, but the fact of having to do a nasopharyngeal swab. So, in short, this was acceptable to the patient. Next, will the reproducibility of the test result and its interpretation be satisfactory in my capacity and setting? So here we just look at a detailed explanation step by step of how the test was done, what test kit were used, what specimens were important, so that we can replicate it in our own setting. And we will see if this interpretation will also be simple enough for us to use when we do this on our own setting already. So some studies might also provide inter-rater agreement and reliability measures of the test. Actually, this was done in this particular study. So yes, this was properly addressed in the Torres article. Okay, now the important question now is, will the test results guide my decision making? How will you answer this now? So we must apply the computed likelihood ratios to determine the post-test probability for a positive or a negative result. The result should help the clinician, either the negative or a positive test, but ideally both, in making decisions regarding the next steps for management of the patient. So the long way of doing this is to compute it manually. First, you convert the pretest probability to pretest odds, multiply the pretest odds by the LR positive if you're computing for the post-test probability of a positive result, and then convert the post-test odds to post-test probability. So by computation, the post-test probability of having a positive result is 93.9%, so that's quite high. If you are not very keen about going through all these steps of calculation, you can actually use the so-called nomogram. So to orient you, the leftmost part of the nomogram corresponds to the pretest probability, the middle line corresponds to the likelihood ratios, and the rightmost line corresponds to your post-test probability. So what do? Remember that our pre-test probability for the patient was 30%. So you just plot it as indicated by the red circle, and then you look at the LR positive. So the LR positive for this patient was 36.3. So that's somewhere between 20 and 50. So what you do is you just connect the two dots and then extend it until it reaches the line of post-test probability. So for this case, if your patient yielded a positive result for the rapid antigen test, the post-test probability reaches almost 95% in the nomogram. So this is similar to your computed post-test probability. Now you also have to compute for the post-test probability of a negative result, going through the same steps of computation, but this time you will use the LR negative instead of the LR positive, which was 0.5. So you could also use a nomogram. So from 30, you plot the 0.5, and the post-test probability of a negative test is almost 20%. So the computed value for your post-test probability for a negative result is 17.7. Now, how will you use this? So remember, I told you earlier that we will use the initial line that we set. So we set our diagnostic threshold at 2%, treatment threshold at 60%, and pretest probability at 30%. So when we do a rapid antigen test and the result comes out positive, we are now going to look at post-test probability. If the result is negative, the post-test probability is 17.7%. So it still falls in your gray area. So the decision now is that you cannot yet totally rule out SARS-CoV-2 infection if you have a negative result from a rapid antigen test. That's why if you have a negative result for this test, it's recommended that you do another test. So ideally, you do an RT-PCR, the confirmatory test, to determine whether the patient really does not have the disease. However, if the result is positive from 30% na pre-test probability, the post-test probability now becomes 93.9%. So because of that, you are somewhat very sure that the patient really has COVID-19 if he tests positive for a rapid antigen test. So you can now advise the patient to isolate and monitor and observe for the development of any symptoms, but the important thing is to isolate him so as not to infect other close contacts. Okay? So what's our application? So using the results of this article, we can say that among asymptomatic household contacts of a COVID-19 case, doing a rapid antigen test will be useful when the test result is positive because, as you saw, the post-test probability jumped way beyond our treatment threshold. However, if the result is negative, additional testing such as the confirmatory RT-PCR test is necessary to be able to confidently rule out the possibility of COVID-19. So what happened to our patient? Rapid antigen testing was done and the result came out positive. Based on the results of the article, we have seen that a positive result moves the post-test probability beyond 90% so that we are very sure that this patient really has SARS-CoV-2 infection. That's why the patient was referred to the BHERT of their barangay. He was admitted at their LGU's isolation facility for observation and monitoring. And of course, you temporarily withheld his clearance for going back to work because he has to undergo the mandatory isolation period. Again, remember that the negative test is not very reliable, so it has to be confirmed by another testing if ever your patient would test negative for a rapid antigen test. So that's it. I hope that with this short exercise and our short discussion, you have been able to appreciate more how to use articles on diagnostic tests in our day-to-day clinic practice and in our encounters with our patients. I hope that in the future, in the very near future, if we're not doing this already, we would really be very conscientious. That's the term that I would like to use in choosing and requesting for diagnostic tests for our patient because we want to give the best management, the best care for each of our Filipino patients and their families. So these are my references for this topic. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for taking time to go through this module on evidence-based clinical decision on articles on diagnostic tests. Thank you very much and have a good day, everyone.
The unique mechanism of action of Sanofi unique 4-strain combination of Bacillus clausii spores begins by ingesting the ampule containing billions of spores of Bacillus clausii. Unlike other probiotics, such as Saccharomyces boulardii and Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, Sanofi unique 4-strain combination of Bacillus clausii spores resist the acidic pH within the stomach and stay intact. At reaching the small bowel, they germinate into their vegetative form, contributing to reduction of diarrhea. The bacilli adhere to the intestinal cells, allowing for mucosal colonization and forming a protective barrier known as a biofilm, which protects the intestinal epithelium from diarrhea-causing pathogenic bacteria. In addition, Sanofi unique 4-strain combination of Bacillus clausii spores produces clausin, a natural antibiotic which activates against gram-positive bacteria like Clostridium difficile and Staphylococcus aureus. Most of the other probiotics do not produce clausin. Sanofi unique 4-strain combination of Bacillus clausii spores resists common antibiotics and survives in the gut up to 14 days after treatment, as opposed to other probiotics which only remain for 5 days. Sanofi unique 4-strain combination of Bacillus clausii spores, prevention and treatment of dysbiosis and antibiotic-associated symptoms